Hello and welcome to the very highly anticipated Iron Man suit up visual effects breakdown. This video, much like the Spider-Man video, took me an enormous amount of time, a lot longer than I was anticipating, but I'm really happy with the result and I think a lot of people thought it was really cool. So yeah, I'm going to show kind of how I did it. This is the main scene, so I have like a master file, which is where I made the Iron Man suit, and then I kind of linked that into all of my other Blender scenes. So this is the model and rig. I didn't make the model myself, and I'm going to give credit to the guy that made it. I think it was Deadcode3 on free3d.com. That's very hard to say. But I did make the rig myself, and this was kind of complicated. I had to kind of teach myself or watch some YouTube tutorials on how to do this because I'd never really rigged anything this complicated before. And the thing that took me a while to learn, which was adding these drivers for all of the little flaps and stuff that open on the suit. So if I click one of these and move it, you can see that it controls things on the suit. And then I've got another one for the flaps on the back of the legs there, and then I've also got one for the shoulders and the kind of back flaps here. So that was really cool. It made it a lot easier than going in and individually selecting stuff and rotating it because the rig was getting a little bit messy. Also for this shot, which is shot 7, I also made an IK system for the legs because I didn't want the feet to move. I can grab the top of the legs and move them and the feet will stay in the same place. So I can't move it too far because otherwise you get this clipping issue, which was a bit of a pain actually for this shot. Okay, so let's start looking at the nitty gritty stuff. I'm not going to go into every single shot, but I'll talk about each part. So like the floor and the arms and the suit and the last shot, which is a bit of a beast on its own. So for this shot, which is shot 1, I had the challenge of basically making the floor kind of open up like this and then having the arms underneath which come out. I modeled and textured this main arm that you see throughout the whole sequence myself, so this took me about half a day. It's all driven by this bone control here and this bone control on the floor, but there's a bone for each bit of the arm essentially. But most of the bones are hidden, so I just have one up here that I can grab and move and it kind of moves the whole arm. And then I also have, like the Iron Man suit, a couple of drivers over here for the claw to open and close and also for it to rotate. This top layer of the floor is a holdout, which means that you won't be able to see it in the final render and it kind of cuts everything out, so I won't be able to see any of the stuff that's under the floor like those 3D models down here until they're actually revealed by this hole in the center. I'm just going to hide this top layer because it's not massively interesting. So this is kind of revealing what's under the hood, quite literally. All of this stuff under the ground is from a kit bash kit. It took me long enough to model the arms that when I realized I probably needed a load of other machinery under the ground just to kind of fill the empty space, I kind of lost my mind. So what I did is I went online, I downloaded a free kit bash kind of machinery kit, which basically just means you get loads of generic machinery parts and you can just sort of slap them into your scene. And it works really well. It's pretty dark down there anyway, and you can only see bits of it if I re-hide this. So I just wanted there to be some silhouettes and some kind of shiny metal objects under there to pick up some of the reflections. I added some very simple animation to a few of the kit bash parts just to make them move and look a bit more dynamic. So this one's literally going up and down, this one's rotating on the x-axis. And then for this one here, it's a piston. I went into edit mode, I made a one shape key where it's kind of at its base position, which is like here. And then I made one where I moved this main column down in the Z-axis, and then I have a keyframe every 15 frames to sort of wipe back and forth between the two shape keys, and that just drives the piston to go up and down. For each of the shots, I had a 3D character that I kind of rigged and put in a rough pose. And I used this human base model to kind of track the suit to myself very crudely. I tried to get the torso to kind of match my movements as best as I could just by hand animating it back and forth. Getting the handover of the suit pieces from the arm to sticking to me was a little bit complicated. It took me about a day to figure it out. Obviously, in the original footage, there's nothing to interact with, so I just kind of pretended that I was getting something heavy put on my arm. And it really sells the interaction with the CG instead of it just being plonked very weightlessly onto my arm. What I settled on in the end is having 2 empties for each stage. So you can see on the arm here, I've got an empty here and an empty here, which is where the eventual placement of the arm is going to go. And those are parented to the armature, which I created, that moves roughly with my body movement. And there's also an empty on the end of each of the arms, which is parented to the last part of the arm, which is this. And that allows the pieces of the armor to stick to the arm until I want them to hand over like this. And so the secret behind getting both of these pieces of armor to change over seamlessly is each of them has 2 constraints on it, 2 child of constraints. And so for this piece, for example, it comes in and until this point, it's a child of this empty, which means it's attached to it and it's going to follow its movement. And then once it gets to the point where I want it to start sticking to me instead of the arm, I animated the influence to go from 1 to 0 over the course of 1 frame. So you can see on this frame, this is 0, this is 1, and then on the next frame, this is 1 and this is 0. And that's changing over from being attached to this empty to being attached to this empty. And now the arm can move away freely and the armor will stay stuck to the suit. So this is shot 8, which is the one where the helmet gets attached to me. This is the only shot where I did an actual object track. So if I go into the motion tracking view, I actually tracked my face for this one. This is the only shot that has some more realistic shadow interaction. I used this base mesh as a shadow catcher for my face, which I'll talk about more in a second when I go into Nuke. Shot 9 and 10 actually didn't have me in them at all, and if I hide the Iron Man suit in this, you can see how I did it. I set up my monopod with a load of tracking markers on it and then just 3D tracked this shot. I put the monopod in the foreground with the markers where I wanted the Iron Man suit to be, because it's quite important to have some parallax information. One of the things that really helped sell the suit into all of the shots is I took a 360 high dynamic range photo in my living room, which means that I captured all the lighting and reflection information, and I was able to kind of project that back onto the suit, which worked really well. This is what it looked like. So this was the living room. The software I use is PT GUI, and it's got a watermark on here because I only used the trial version. Instead of using a 360 camera, I actually used my A7 III and used a very wide angle 6.5mm lens and took a load of photos like this, which were all stitched together in post. I took them at 5 different exposures, which allowed me to capture the absolute highlights and the absolute shadows of the shot. And then in Blender, I can change the exposure value of the HDRI. So I was able to dial in the strength to get the best look I could and match what the actual lighting was like in my living room. And the other benefit of this, other than just getting the lighting right, is you also pick up all of the actual reflections of my living room, which looks really cool. So if you kind of look at bits of the suit, you can see it picks up the texture of the floor. You can see the shapes of the windows being reflected in the shoulders there. And so it really sells it in because you can see the environment that the suit's in actually reflecting off of it. So this last shot I built from scratch. It's entirely CG. I considered filming this on my drone originally, but I knew that I wanted the camera to be moving quite fast and also be quite shaky, which doesn't really happen on a drone. So in the end, I opted just for doing this in full CG, which I think was probably the right choice, even though it's not quite as photorealistic. I fleshed out the scene fairly quickly, so the buildings are using the kind of Ian Hubert technique of projection mapping some facades and then kind of just extruding some details. I did a couple of details like an air conditioner and some drain pipes and stuff on the building, so they weren't just complete boxes. I downloaded this model of a tree and just kind of scattered it around to hide the fact that I've got some very plain textures underneath it. A couple of models of some cars, one of them's just driving along the road, which is animated. I used the cell fracture add-on to fracture the roof and then add a rigid body simulation on it, so the suit just pushes all of those chunks out the way, which looks really cool. I did a really simple smoke sim just to do a bit of a dust cloud as the suit is blowing through the ceiling, which just added a bit of impact. It's literally just an icosphere that's emitting some smoke, and the roof itself is set to be a collision object so it doesn't clip through it. The camera has a load of noise modifiers on it, which is how I created the camera shake, and then here I just did one last keyframe on the rotation to make a big shake as the suit flies past the camera. So yeah, that's pretty much all of the Blender stuff. I'd say most of the shots took me between half a day and a day, and then this last full CG shot took me about 2.5, 3 days. It also took about 15 hours to render. I did all the compositing for this video in Nuke, and this is what most of the Nuke scripts looked like. Nothing too crazy. This top section is the cleanup and the shadows, and then this bottom section is compositing the CG suit. For most of the shots I had to do a bit of cleanup and painting because my t-shirt was actually clipping through the suit. And then here I'm just adding some of the shadows from the suit, which looks a bit crazy without the suit on it, but it's just adding some kind of contact shadows where the suit is close to my body. So then I have the render of the arms, which goes on here. I rendered a depth pass out of Blender so that I could use the ZD focus node in Nuke and set it so that some bits would be in focus and some bits would be out of focus depending on how far away they are from the camera. And that beds the arms into the shots really nicely because the depth of field was quite shallow in all of these, so I wanted the depth of field to look correct. And then I had to do some roto to put the bits of my arm back on top that shouldn't be clipping over them. And then there's the shadow of the pieces of the suit that the arms are putting on me, and then the suit goes on top of that. For most of the shots I rendered a Kryptomat out of Blender as well, which was really handy for grading the individual pieces of the suit. If you don't know what a Kryptomat is, it's basically a pass that's just assigned loads of different colours to the materials and the objects in the scene, which separates them out. And then I can use that to go in and say, okay, I want to change the colour of some of the gold bits, and it will create a mask for me that's just the gold parts in the scene. So I did that for the red and the gold in most of the shots. So that's how pretty much every shot was composited, so I'm not going to talk for ages about that. The only other thing that I am going to mention is this shot. This is the shot where I used a shadow catcher on my face, which gave me the realistic shadows from the suit, which worked really well. The shadow build for this shot was a bit more complicated than the other ones because I had the CG pass. It starts off like this, and then I have a couple of grade nodes creating the shadow of the suit on my neck. And then I have this render, which is the shadow pass from Blender. And you can see that as the pieces get closer, they cast some very realistic looking shadows. And so to combine them, instead of just making everything darker where the shadows should be, I made a version of the plate where the contrast was reduced massively. So as well as being darker, it's also reduced the highlights. And the reason I did this is once the helmet's on, there shouldn't really be any highlights on my head because they're coming from the windows, and the helmet is blocking the windows from my skin. So this is essentially like a version of me in shadow. It's not perfect, but it looks a lot better than just making it darker. And then I combine that with the original plate, and I'm using the render from Blender to dictate where they get combined. So where the white bits are from the shadows, that will be using the low contrast plate, and where it's black, that will be the original plate. Looks a little bit crazy on its own like that, but then once it's cut out and my head is put back on top of the shot, it looks like this. And then on top of that goes the helmet. And so if I turn that off, this is what it looks like with no shadows. It looks like my face is just kind of cut out and stuck inside the helmet. The shadows really sell the fact that my face is inside the helmet, and it's got a nice soft shadow from the kind of mask of the helmet here, and then all of the interaction around the sides where they're blocking the light as well. And then the final touch for any of the shots that have the eyes in them, or the chest piece, or the repulsors that should have a glow on them, I separated out the emission pass, added a bit of a glow to it, and then that gets plussed on top of the original render. So it gives it that nice blue glow, which is synonymous with the Iron Man look. So there we go. That is how I made the Iron Man video. It was about 9 days of pretty much constant work. It took me ages, another very overly ambitious project. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope that this visual effects breakdown was useful as well. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, consider subscribing and liking the video, and I'll see you very soon.